Hi everybody. For our first PowerPoint, let's talk about grammar just as a basic idea because it's important for us to all be on the same. So, grammar, I think one way to look at it is that it's basically rules about speaking and writing, and that those rules may be quite different for speaking and writing and different registers. Not all the rules, however, are of the same kind. Some of them are deterministic rules. And those are rules that, well, I'm going to say always apply, although even that I think we can wonder about. So here, the definite article always comes before the noun, the cup, and cup the. In English, that just doesn't occur. Now, who knows, maybe in the future that might change. But right now, it really does always apply, and the data show. But there are also probabilistic rules. And that are the rules that state what's most likely to occur in particular circumstances. So when we have this relative pronoun, we met a woman who had lived in Berlin. That who is almost always going to be included. However, you may notice that, especially in spoken English, and especially after their constructions, there was a shop in the village sold homemade ice cream. I mean, it's not what we would do when we're writing, but when we're speaking, that does happen. Not as often as the other way, but it still does happen. So, we can also look at grammar as being a structure or grammar as being a choice. Grammar as structure means, what do you need to know in order to construct a sentence or clause appropriately? And here's one structural rule, the determiner none, and again, I'm going to say always, but it's not exactly true, but is almost always followed by the preposition of. None of my friends rather than none my friends. In choice, however, it can be based on the relationship that you have as a speaker or writer with the listener and reader. So, you could say, looking forward to seeing you, don't know. Notice we don't use a subject there. She said the central heating needed to be repaired. She said that she's going to quit her job. There are words that can be removed, and it's based on the relationship between the speaker and the listener. In Chapter 1 in your book, they also talk about two issues that I think are important for us to notice: registers and dialects. Registers are the varieties of language that are associated with different circumstances and purposes. Now, do you remember the registers that they talk about in our book? Hopefully, you remember that they talk about conversation, academic writing, newspapers, and fiction. That's the fourth one, yeah. So those are the four registers that they use, and the authors of this book believe that while they are not entirely, they don't cover every kind of language, they are representative of a lot of different types of language, in terms of the purpose and in terms of the mode, all of that. So they feel pretty good that they are covering a lot with those. The other issue, though, is dialect. And do you remember in the book, what were the main dialects that they talked about making a distinction on occasion? They will make a distinction on occasion in the book. No, it's not between Atlanta and Boston, but rather it's the American dialect and the British dialect. Although they did make the very valid point that when you look at the United States, or if you look at Britain, the dialects, you can break them down quite a bit. And then they also talk briefly about dialects from other different areas of the world. The Irish, the Indian, West African, all of that. And it's not just, dialects are not just based on geographic areas either. It can also be based on gender. A lot of times it's on class and so on. When we talk about grammar, we're looking at prescription versus description. And a descriptive approach to grammar is based on the observation of use. So in other words, it looks at what is actually happening when people use language. And it's sort of in a sense, I guess you could call it a value-free way of looking at grammar. Because if enough people use it, then it's part of the grammar. Prescriptive rules, however, are often socially based rules that people use to identify speakers or writers as belonging to a particular group. And it can be in a positive way or it can be in a negative way. And depending on who's doing the identifying, that also makes a determination of whether it's positive or negative. Can you think of examples of that kind of prescriptive rules that either you use or someone you know uses or were used when you were learning English? And also, what do you think this book that we're reading, that we're using in this class, how would you describe that? Would it be descriptive or prescriptive? We're going to look a little bit more about the prescriptive versus descriptive grammar, and this is adapted from a University of Pennsylvania course. So, in prescriptive grammar, it would be said that what's good is he doesn't know, and what's bad is he don't know. Now, you may think, well, I already know that that's good and that's bad, and that's using prescriptive grammar. It doesn't mean that prescriptive grammar is a bad thing. But it's prescriptive rather than descriptive. Because in descriptive grammar, when you notice what's actually being used, you will discover that he doesn't know and he don't know are both used. And it's depending on the style, the dialect, the register, I would also add. But they're both used, and they're used effectively to communicate. However, when you look at language in use, you will determine, even in the descriptive grammar, that there are some things that are ungrammatical, like he not know, he knownt, not know he. Those are not used in fluent, native-like communication. And those are considered ungrammatical, even in a descriptive grammar. And here's a little example of when we look at things from the prescriptive perspective, excuse me, about whether things are what's good and what's bad. In Old English, you can see here there was the first and second and third person verb forms, and they were much more like some other languages that have multiple forms. And then it started to become modified, so I sing could have the E on it or not. And then it started to modify even more about 300 years later in early modern English, where I sing and we sing are just used without any sort of marking. And now we have modern English, which is I sing, you sing, he sings, and we sing. And they sing, yeah. So notice now we only have the marking for the third person, which was not what was going on in the past. And it doesn't always go on in other languages either. So what do you think might happen in the future? Certainly if we look at this pattern, well, maybe they'll get rid of everything, and it will just be he sing instead of he sings. Who knows? I mean, right now it may seem difficult for us to imagine that, but imagine the people back in the 1400s, maybe they had trouble imagining what we're doing today. And I want to talk about 4 types of correctness, one of which is the established criteria of educated written language. And this is what we were just talking about, that third person singular S. She goes rather than she go. She go is understandable, and it's often used. I hear it frequently. But it has a sense of identifying someone within certain groups or being within a certain environment or situation when they use that. Another area of that sort of correctness is not using double negatives. Even though we realize if someone said he didn't see nobody, we realize what the speaker means, and nobody would imagine that they're saying they saw somebody. But it's also, again, it's considered to be that form of correctness. And being able to create complete sentences. even though oftentimes we don't. Now, a second type of correctness are the issues in which educated people have differing views, but they see them as options rather than a right and a wrong. Like, who did you see versus whom did you see? And here are some other ones. The data is unreliable. The data are unreliable. All of these are things where different people will use different forms, and they all still fit into the sense of correctness. Then there are things, changes in the spoken language that people continue to resist. If you say, me and Harry went downtown, or what are you thinking? She was, I'm getting out of here. All of these kinds of things where it's used in spoken language, and there are some people who resist that kind of use, even though it's very common. And then the fourth type is just creations by what are called self-appointed grammarians that don't really have any basis in what's being used in the language. One of those is not ending a sentence with a preposition, something that I learned early on not to do. Not having split infinitives, the whole thing about shall versus will, and it is I, and all of those things are not, those are creations that don't really have any base in usage, either historically or current. We also have endings shift over time, and words in general shift. But this, I think, is an interesting thing to look at as we consider whether things are correct or not correct. Skim milk is sort of our new form, but it used to be called skimmed milk, and ice cream was iced cream. And now we use whipped cream and creamed corn, but who knows, it may be in the future it'll be whipped cream and creamed corn. And it's just something that happens over time. So grammar is an evolving set of rules. And there's Montgomery Burns enjoying this so-called iced cream, which was very effective in there because it also set him within a certain time frame. And that's one of the things that language and the use of grammar can do. Here's another example of how the grammar will change. Box set versus boxed set. Boxed with an ED was almost half and half back in 2001, and I would argue even earlier it was probably more. And then the box set without the ED started taking off until finally in 2012 it's at a 10-to-1 ratio over boxed set. And there, of course, there are some usages are based on the social nature of language, and some can become hopelessly outdated. Hast thou faxed the document yet? And also some styles are appropriate in certain circumstances. When you're talking to the Queen of England, perhaps you would pay more attention to the whom, more so than you would with the else. And also we have some styles that are just created, and who knows, maybe in the future they will become much more common, thanks to Star Trek and to Yoda. Okay, so really what we need to remember are that different styles are appropriate for different occasions. And that's where it's so useful to use sort of this corpus-based, which is something we'll talk about in more detail later, approach to grammar, where we actually look at language in use. I think we're about set for now. Thank you so much, and let me know if you have any questions.